Hello and welcome to Grief Seeds, a podcast where you'll find insights, reframings, metaphors, and visualizations, all known as grief seeds, to help you cultivate growth and healing in your life after loss. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I'm an intuitive grief guide and author, and on this show, I'll share insights from my interactions with clients, wise words from fellow grievers, and personal stories from my own life, with the hope that they transform your grief as they have transformed mine. Because even when it doesn't feel like it, we are planting the seeds of growth in the midst of great pain and heartache. Your grief is welcome here. Hi there, grief growers, and welcome to another episode of Grief Seeds. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Today, I'd like to invite you to release the myth of arriving. And I'll tell you what I mean by this through an illustration from my childhood. I remember one of my very favorite times of year as a kid was back to school season, and that can definitely make me weird. I welcome your judgments. But one of my favorite rituals, especially in elementary school, was to go back to school shopping for the school supplies, the erasers, the pencils, the crayons, the pencil boxes, the binders, the paper, everything neatly checked off a list and placed so carefully into a backpack for the first day of school. Nothing opened, nothing touched or used yet. Everything still pristine and packaged and perfect and complete. The list was complete. And I would go to sleep those nights before the first day of school for years and years, feeling so safe and settled knowing that I had everything I needed and I had accomplished everything that was required of me. Now, the older I got, and especially after the death of my mother, I realized that I so rarely, if at all, have this feeling or this emotional experience anymore. In adulthood, and sometimes maybe for you in childhood too, if you have lived a life full of loss, there is no such thing as completing the list. There is no such thing as arriving at a finish line. There is no such thing as crossing into a box an official designation of finished. And this is something that can be really frustrating for us as grievers because so much language around grief and loss, it implies a finish line or a doneness somewhere that simply doesn't exist. It talks about being recovered from grief and loss, or healed, or I have moved on, or I have let it go. These things happened back there, and now I'm in a totally different place. I have finished that. I have wrapped it up. I have completed it. I have tied a bow on it. It is all done. And now I sleep soundly at night, knowing that I have fully addressed the full weight and extent of my grief, pain, loss, heartache, and mourning. It's immensely frustrating that cannot be true for us in grief. So today I invite you to release the myth of arriving, because it is just that. It is a myth, grief growers, that we will ever arrive at any sort of end point in our grief. This can be frustrating, this can be disheartening, this can be woe-inducing to know that there is nothing in the future that we are striving for that will determine whether or not we are done with grief. Grief is not a thing that gets done. Grief is a thing that is constantly being worked on and churned through and processed and reiterated upon and evolved as we grow. In one of my online courses, I refer to grief as a long-term relationship. Whether it's one that's as intimate and as close as a marriage, or even a friendship, remains to be seen, but it is something that once it enters our life, grief companions us until the day we die. We keep learning more about it, we keep gaining perspective on it, it keeps showing up in different ways and on different milestones and in different grief anniversaries, and all of these iterations of grief and loss and our expansion as people make it so that grief never truly gets done and shelved and put away in the past. I will say there is some hope to this, though, or I hesitate to use the phrase bright side, but the alternative to this is that because there is no finish line for grief, you don't have to try so hard to get to one. You don't have to take all the workshops or read all the books or listen to all the podcasts or do all the journaling or cram all the rituals into your day in an effort to feel that grief is complete. It's not possible, so you can release yourself from that pressure. And instead, see grief as this living, breathing thing that will expand and contract and show up in so many different ways throughout your life until you die. It may not always be as intense as today, or as dark as today, or as despairing as today. Grief is a very wide umbrella. It includes things like joy. It includes things like nostalgia. It includes things like growth. Yeah. And allowing all of that to be true as you grieve across time, you can release this notion of one day I will be through with grief. I won't have to do this anymore. I can leave that back there. Something that's been really helpful to me and to my clients as well, in terms of releasing the myth of arriving, is changing things to ings as opposed to eds. I have healed from that versus I am healing from that. Making it something that's an active process as opposed to something that happened back there. I have learned that versus I am learning that. I saw that versus I am seeing that. That one's a little different because there's not an ED, but you get the idea. There's this illusion that we have recovered when in fact we are constantly recovering from what has happened to us, from the losses that we faced. We bring everything about the people we've lost, our old selves, our present selves, our dreams for our future selves, with us into the future. So why would we not speak of them as if they are still happening? Our grief is still a reality for us. I have not grieved. I am grieving. I have not mourned. I am still mourning. And that's okay. That's appropriate. That's normal and human. Because you know what it is, grief growers? It's alive. It continues to be alive. Unlike our loved ones, unlike our dreams, unlike our old selves, grief does not die. Grief comes along for the ride, and so we have not grieved. We are grieving. And we are allowed to keep grieving because grief does not die. Grief comes along for all of it, for as long as we live. So I invite you gently, with so much ease, with releasing of the hands and palms, to let go of the myth of arriving. And we can even use our own verbiage on this today. I am practicing letting go of the myth of arriving. I have not let it go. I am actively letting it go every single day, this illusion that one day I will be done. I am practicing letting it go. Ing, 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 ing. Releasing the myth of arriving. I invite you to take a deep breath in with me here. And out. My darling grief grower, as you continue to grieve, as you continue to mourn, may you give yourself permission to set down anything that sells the belief that one day you will be done and finished, and that everything about grief will be checked off a list and you can move on into the future unconstrained, unconfined, and free from grief ever again. May you gently place that story on the ground. May you allow it to dissolve in favor of the truer story that grief does not die, that grief continues on the road with you. It reminds you of all you have lost and all you have yet to lose, but also all the ways you have loved and all the ways you have cared, all the ways you are loving and all the ways you are caring. Reminding you that life didn't just happen back there and that's done and that's over and that's complete and recovered and healed. But in fact, all of that life, that loving, that caring, that recovering, that healing is happening now for you in the present and will continue to happen going forward. You have not grieved. You are grieving. And that is appropriate. That is normal. That is fitting. That is as it should be. I invite you to take a deep breath in with me here. And out. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Seeds. So that's all for this episode of Grief Seeds. Thank you so much for listening today. You can find additional grief support at shelbyforsythia.com or by following me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you in your life after loss, please leave a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And be sure to share Grief Seeds with a friend, because you never know what someone you love is going through. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for financially keeping this podcast on the air. If you'd like to support Grief Seeds on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge, you can do so at patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. My Patreon supporters get access to behind-the-scenes content, including a once-a-month grief support call with me and 5 90-minute workshops with topics decided by grievers themselves. Again, that website is patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. Music for Grief Seeds is performed by Addie Goldstein. As always, my dear grief growers, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.